We know where the Battle of Hastings was. We know where Bosworth, Bannockburn and Flodden were. We even know the site of the Battle of Maldon in the year 991, although most people have never heard of it. But we genuinely don't know where Boudica's final battle was. We're talking about one of the most consequential battles in Roman Britain, a moment when Rome came very close to losing control of the province. It has no address, no marker, and no place on the historic England battlefield register, and this is almost symbolic as that register can only list battles whose location can actually be identified on the ground. Hi, I'm Harriet. Welcome back to the channel. In this episode, we're going to dig into the main candidates for where Boudica's battlefield was and find out why, with all the technology we have now, nobody's managed to find it. And there's a strange Roman site that might just help us solve the mystery. In a village called Baggington, on the southeastern edge of Coventry, there's a Roman fort that really shouldn't look the way it does. Not because it's unusual to find a Roman fort in the English Midlands. The Romans scattered them across Britain with predictable enthusiasm. But what makes this one strange is what's inside it. The fort is called the Lunt. It was built around AD 60, right at the height of the Boudican revolt, and as we'll see, this timing is important. It sits on a high plateau above the River Sow, close to the junction of Watling Street and the Fosse Way, two of the greatest Roman roads of Roman Britain. The location makes perfect sense, and at first glance, the fort looks fairly standard. And then you come around to the eastern defences. The wall curves, and not by accident. It bows out in a pronounced arc, breaking the strict rectangular shape Roman military engineers usually preferred. From Britain to the eastern provinces, Roman forts tend to follow the same basic plan: straight walls and right angles and that familiar playing card shape. Now at the Lunt, someone has altered that structure deliberately. The reason for the curve is what lies inside it. It's a circular structure, 32 metres, which is about 105 feet across, dug into the sand and gravel, enclosed by a timber stockade with a single funnelled entrance and a double gate. The floor was kept smooth and level and covered in sand. And what makes this structure stand out is that, as far as archaeologists know, it's the only known Roman example of its kind. They call it a gyrus, a term commonly used for the ring, though the terminology itself is a bit uncertain, which may be a clue in itself. This structure wasn't something the Romans built very often. The leading interpretation, supported by horse harness fittings, evidence for stabling, and extensive metalworking at the site, is that the ring was used for training horses, probably by lunging, with a trainer in the centre and the horse worked around the edge on a long rein. This is standard cavalry training, just on an unusually large and formal scale. The gyrus wasn't part of the fort's first layout either. The Lunt appears to have been built first around AD 60 and then later altered, with buildings removed and the outer wall rebuilt to make room for the ring. Whatever this structure was for, it mattered enough to reshape the fort around it. So now, this is interesting, but why does it matter when we're talking about finding Boudica's battle location? It's the potential of why it was built and when. So one possibility is that after Boudica's defeat, the Romans needed somewhere to process and retrain large numbers of horses, whether captured from the rebels gathered during the campaign or brought in for renewed military use. An army on that scale would have involved cavalry mounts, pack animals, transport stock and wagons. The Lunt could fit that wider post-revolt military context. Obviously, this doesn't prove that the battlefield was right next door, and it doesn't prove the ring was built specifically because of Boudica. That's the part where the evidence runs out and interpretation begins, but it definitely means that this part of the Midlands mattered operationally in the aftermath of the revolt. So the Lunt may give us a region, or at least a possible region for Boudica's battlefield, but of course it doesn't give us an exact location. And that's a problem because this was a critical battle against Roman rule. Boudica was queen of the Iceni, and by this point she'd become the figurehead of a much wider uprising against Roman rule after the seizure of Iceni lands, her public flogging, and what was done to her daughters. What had begun as outrage had become personal, political, and very hard to stop. In the battle, she led the Iceni with the Trinovantes, probably the clearest named allies, and probably drew in other groups as well, though the sources are frustratingly vague on exactly who. Now, on the Roman side, Suetonius seems to have only had around 10 or 11,000 men. In contrast, Boudica's army was much, much larger, probably many tens of thousands, even if the ancient numbers are almost certainly inflated. For the actual location, we really only have one literary clue, and it comes from a Roman senator born a few years after the battle. Tacitus published the Annals around AD 116, roughly 55 years after the revolt. His father-in-law, Agricola, had served in Britain during the campaign, so Tacitus may have had access to near contemporary, possibly eyewitness-informed material. Of course, that cuts both ways. It may have brought him closer to the event, but it also means he was probably not a completely neutral observer. That makes the Annals about as valuable as we're likely to get for a battle fought in AD 60 with no fixed location. When you read it, the terrain description is surprisingly precise. According to Tacitus, Suetonius chose a position approached by a narrowed defile, secured in the rear by a wood and with open ground in front. In other words, a channeled approach, a protected rear, and a clear field of view ahead. This is why the terrain mattered so much. Suetonius didn't just need good ground, he needed ground that would stop a much larger force from spreading around him and swallowing his army whole. Tacitus also said the Britons placed their women in wagons at the edge of the battlefield to watch what they thought would be a victory. Now, if this is broadly right, then once their front broke, those wagons may have turned the rear of the field into a killing crush. What had been arranged as a place to witness triumph became a barrier to escape. Tacitus presents this as a deliberate choice by Suetonius. He didn't just blunder into a last stand. He saw terrain that suited a smaller, disciplined army and he used it. Cassius Dio, writing much later, gives the campaign a slightly different emphasis and suggests that Suetonius was under greater pressure. But the broad picture is similar. Difficult approach, open killing field, and a battle fought where the Romans could force their enemy into a narrow front. There is one important caveat here, though. Ancient historians were not writing field reports, and when Tacitus gives us speeches before the battle, those are almost certainly literary constructions rather than transcripts. And even so, this part of the description is detailed enough to matter. But what Tacitus doesn't give us is a place name. And this is the crux of our mystery. The description is specific enough to rule out much of southern Britain, which means there are candidates, plural, and they sit in different parts of the country depending on how you reconstruct Suetonius's route, what marching speed you think was realistic, and how much weight you give to roads, terrain, or logistics. Finding this battlefield would do more than pin a dot on the map. It would tell us which route Suetonius actually took, which theories fall away, and whether the accepted shape of the campaign is even right. Before we get to this serious archaeological debate, there's one theory worth mentioning because it shows how these stories form in the first place. King's Cross in North London has a persistent local tradition attached to it. The old name, Battle Bridge, linked to a river crossing, encouraged antiquarians in the 18th century to imagine a major ancient battle there. From that, the Boudica story grew. At some point, the legend expanded into the idea that she's buried beneath platform 10. Modern historians are clear that there's no evidence for any of this, but stories like this have their own odd durability. When the sources leave gaps, folklore tends to move in and furnish the room. And as we've said, the real battlefield has no settled name and no plaque telling you where to stand. At the moment, it's just ground. So the search has to work from evidence, and that evidence tends to break into three competing ways of thinking. The first one starts with the backbone of the Roman Empire, roads. Manchester in Warwickshire has been argued as the candidate since the 19th century. It sits on Watling Street near the River Anker, roughly between London and the legendary base at Wroxeter. That makes it a plausible point for a retreating Roman army to regroup and make a stand. The terrain doesn't match Tacitus perfectly, but it's close enough that Graham Webster has treated it as a leading possibility. So Manchester has the route logic, but the weakness is obvious. There's no battlefield archaeology there. High Cross in Leicestershire makes a similar argument, but in a slightly more ambitious way. It sits at the junction of Watling Street and the Fosse Way, and that gives it strong strategic logic. Kevin Carroll has argued that this is where Suetonius most plausibly waited, especially if he hoped to link up with forces moving along the Fosse Way. It's a smart roads argument, but again, roads are not artefacts. High Cross has logic, but not proof. Now, the second approach starts not with roads, but with the shape of the land. Church Stowe in Northamptonshire is one of the most interesting terrain-based proposals. Landscape Analysis, published in 2010, compared topographic data across large areas of southern Britain against the battlefield description from Tacitus. On that reading, the valley below Church Stowe emerged as a strong fit. It offers a constrained approach, rising ground, and the kind of channeled battlefield the Roman account seems to describe. Now, Cuttle Mill near Towcester is another terrain candidate. It lies where Watling Street passes through a smaller valley, and it's been argued to fit Tacitus reasonably well. Claims have circulated that human remains were once found across a wide area nearby, though that point has never really become a secure part of the academic case. So the terrain argument sounds scientific, and sometimes it is, but it still doesn't produce consensus. And then there's a third approach to this problem, which is more disruptive. Instead of choosing a different spot on Watling Street, it questions whether Suetonius went up Watling Street at all. A minority of historians argue that after leaving London, he may have moved west, not north, perhaps towards Silchester and the Second Legion. If that reading is right, the whole Midlands focus might be wrong, and the battlefield could lie much farther southwest, with places in the Kennet Valley coming into play instead. In other words, this theory solves one problem by blowing up the map entirely. Most scholars still favour the Watling Street route, but this is the kind of problem where one altered assumption can move the whole map. And that really is where things stand. This list of possible sites isn't exhaustive either. Other candidates have been proposed as well, from Surrey to Hertfordshire, but most run into the same wall. It's interesting logic with no decisive archaeology. And by now, you'd think we would have found the site. We haven't. Later battlefields are often identified through metal detecting and survey archaeology. Weapons, armour fragments, horse gear, coins, buckles, shot, all of it can survive in the ground. The Battle of Bosworth was effectively relocated through archaeology in 2009. A Roman battlefield could, in theory, be just as revealing. Pylon heads survive well, so do fittings, tools, and pieces of military equipment. If archaeologists were standing on the right field with the right methods, they might recognise it quite quickly. Now, that said, even if it was found, it probably wouldn't look dramatic. It would look like archaeology usually does, a spread of metal and disturbed soil, just enough consistency to say that something violent happened here. Battlefields can be stripped almost immediately. The metal gets collected and bodies are moved and buried or left to decay unevenly. Later farming scatters what remains. 2,000 years is more than enough time to turn a clear event horizon into a very thin archaeological signal. And it's important to know that there have been serious attempts to find it. Geophysical surveys at leading candidate sites and wider landscape analysis using satellite elevation data, this kind of thing happens all the time. At one stage, terrain modelling generated hundreds of possible matches to this Tacitus description, which sounds impressive until you imagine trying to survey every one of them properly. The target area is just too large. And for all the modelling and debate, the strangest physical clue we still may have is that warped fort at Baggington, with its unique ring built at exactly the right moment. It doesn't solve the mystery, obviously, but it does keep us pointing back towards it. So what do you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I really do read every one of them. And if you've enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. I'll see you next time.